War is not just about victory, nor is it merely a matter of strategy and weapons. Sometimes, war is simply about surviving another day. In the midst of the freezing winter of 1942, a group of Soviet soldiers found themselves trapped in a small village called Ovsyanikovo, near the town of Rzhev. They were exhausted, starving, and constantly under relentless attack from German forces. The film 1942, Rzhev portrays the brutal, realistic and psychologically grueling side of war. There are no superheroes here. There are only ordinary people, forced to survive in the hell. Here is a complete summary of the film Rzhev. The start of the battle. The story begins after Soviet forces successfully recaptured a small village from the German army. However, that victory came at a heavy price. Of a company that originally numbered in the hundreds, only a dozen or so soldiers remain alive. Their bodies are covered in wounds, their clothes are in tatters, and their ammunition is running low. They were led by a young lieutenant who was trying to keep his men's spirits up. But things took a turn for the worse when they were ordered to defend the village at all costs. There was no help. There wasn't enough food, and retreating meant being branded a traitor. This is where the film begins to show that the soldiers' greatest enemy was not just the Germans, but also their own fear and the pressure from within their own ranks. Tension began to mount amongst the soldiers. Some still believed in victory, whilst others simply wanted to get home alive. The film gradually reveals the soldiers' humanity. They are not war machines. They are afraid. They are hungry. They are exhausted. And most painfully of all, they realize they are unlikely to survive. The German counter-offensive. Shortly afterwards, German forces launched a massive counter-offensive. Artillery fire reduced the village buildings to rubble, one by one. Bullets flew ceaselessly. The remaining Soviet soldiers tried to hold the ground using trenches and the ruins of houses. The battle scenes in this film feel incredibly realistic. There is no over-the-top heroic music. All that can be heard are the sounds of explosions, cries of pain, and the frightened breathing of the soldiers. One by one, the soldiers began to fall. Some were killed by snipers. Some were blown to pieces by mortars. And some didn't even have time to utter their last words. This film truly depicts the chaos of war in its raw form, without any emotional filters. The situation grew increasingly tense when an NKVD officer arrived in the village. The NKVD was the Soviet secret police, notorious for their brutality during the war. Their task was not only to keep an eye on the enemy, but also to ensure that Soviet soldiers did not retreat or mutiny. The officer arrived harboring suspicions. He believed there was a traitor amongst the surviving soldiers. A high-pressure interrogation began. The soldiers, who had previously been busy fighting the Germans, now began to suspect one another. The film shifts from a mere physical war to a psychological one. Everyone feared being accused of cowardice. Everyone feared execution. And everyone began to lose trust in one another. Internal conflict. Amidst the threat of a German attack, tensions within the troops were mounting. Some soldiers began to question their commanders' decisions. Some felt they were merely being used as cannon fodder by the military high command. One of the film's most powerful moments is when the soldiers begin to speak honestly about their fears. They were not talking about victory. They simply wanted to live. But the war left them no choice. This film shows how war can gradually break a person's spirit, even before enemy bullets kill them. An increasingly brutal battle. The Germans' next attack was far more brutal. Tanks began to close in on the village. Soviet soldiers, lacking anti-tank weapons, had to defend themselves with grenades and whatever rifles they had. This scene is full of tension. The soldiers hid behind the rubble as they waited for the tanks to approach. Some of them were willing to sacrifice themselves to stop the enemy's combat vehicles. Explosion after explosion shook the village. Fire engulfed the wooden houses. The snow turned red with blood, and the screams of the victims filled the cold air of Rzhev. The film truly shows that war is no place for glory, but rather a place where people lose everything. Fading hope. The longer they held out, the fewer Soviet soldiers there were. Food ran out. Medicines were almost non-existent. There were only a few rounds of ammunition left. Some soldiers were seriously wounded and beyond saving. Yet they remained on the front line because they had no other choice. At this point, hope began to fade. Many soldiers realized they might not make it out of the village alive. But they held the ground. Not because they weren't afraid, but because the war had forced them to keep going. Betrayal and suspicion. NKVD officers grew increasingly aggressive in their search for traitors. He began accusing some of the soldiers of deliberately wanting to retreat. Tensions rose when one of the soldiers was accused of collaborating with the enemy. The atmosphere became extremely tense. Amidst the threat of German bullets, they also had to face threats from within their own ranks. This film reveals the dark side of the Soviet war regime at the time. That sometimes the fear of one's superiors is even greater than the fear of the enemy. And this is where the true strength of the film Rzhev lies. This film is not just about the war against Germany, but also about the war against the system, fear, and despair. The Last Stand. When the German forces launched their final assault, the village lay almost completely in ruins. The remaining Soviet soldiers fought with all their might. They fired until the very last bullet. They fought on despite being covered in wounds. And they held the ground even though there was almost no hope left. The film's climactic scene feels deeply emotional and brutal. There is no grand victory. There are no heroic speeches. There are only people trying to survive amidst the ruins. One by one, the soldiers fell until only a few remained. In the end, the battle in the village left deep scars on all who survived. There was no sense of joy. There was no victory celebration. All that remained was exhaustion, trauma and grief. The film Rzhev concludes its story on a somber and realistic note, that war never truly produces winners. Even those who survived lost a part of themselves. The significance of the film Rzhev. This film conveys a powerful message about the human side of war. Rzhev shows that soldiers are not merely statistical figures in history. They are ordinary people with fears, dreams, and a desire to return home. The film also depicts how war can destroy human morale, not just through bullets and explosions, but also through pressure, paranoia, and the loss of hope. Furthermore, the film highlights the harshness of the Soviet military system during the Second World War. Many soldiers were forced to hold the ground even when the situation had become almost impossible. And that is what makes this film feel so realistic and harrowing. Closing remarks. Rzhev is no ordinary war film. It does not attempt to make war look cool or heroic. On the contrary, It portrays war as a nightmare filled with suffering. With its chilling atmosphere, somber cinematography and powerful performances, Rzhev stands as one of the most realistic Russian war films ever made. And after watching this film, we are reminded that behind every major war in history, there are always ordinary people who become victims. What do you think of the film Rzhev? Does this film succeed in showing the true reality of war? Share your thoughts in the comments section. And don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating film reviews, exclusively on this channel.